Doris prayed for what I have to share, so I won't pray again. Our focus today is on our relationship with creation. And so I'll start with a memory that I have. I'm not a very remembering sort of person. I don't have huge numbers of memories, but this one is very vivid. It was way back in the 70s, and I was living in Kitsilano when you could still afford to live there. And I had friends up at UBC. He was doing an MA in the biology department in fisheries. So I accompanied them one weekend out to, into the interior to a lake where he had to sort of catch, he put nets out to catch fish so that he could analyze how they were growing or something. So we went out in the middle of the night, and this huge lightning storm hit. And there we are on the water, huge trees all around us, just lightning bait right there. So Godfrey, being sensible, he was rowing like hell for the shore. But I didn't work this up. I was just exulting in the presence of the Lord. I might have ended up in the presence of the Lord. But it was a moment when I knew that I was encountering in nature the God who created nature. Whereas Godfrey knew that he was looking at something life-threatening. And in a way, of course, that's very similar to Jesus on the lake as he's going over to deal with the man with the legion. His disciples are all petrified in the storm, and he's asleep, right? And he even rebukes them for their lack of faith. So nature, creation, the material creation is a very ambiguous entity. It all depends on how we see it. If we see it as God's creation, I'm not faulting Godfrey for his particular response, but if we see it as something under his control, which is obviously what Jesus did, because he rebuked his disciples for their lack of faith, right? Then it's a completely different world to live in than if it's just nature read in tooth and claw. It's exactly the same nature, but two completely different perspectives. So we did read the Apostles' Creed, and obviously I believe in God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth. It's a foundation of not only the Jewish faith, but of ours, and indeed of Islam. If you look at the Nicene Creed, it's a little bit more explicit at this point, the maker of all things visible and invisible. So that's a very big topic I have to cover here. And clearly the Bible, especially the Old Testament, is full of testimony to God as creator. It's a very foundational element of our faith. And the things where the foundation has been well laid in the Old Testament don't necessarily get the same, focus in the New, right? So there's not as much in the way of psalms celebrating God as creator, but that's all presupposed. So because of how big the topic is, inevitably I'm going to have to be selective, and I'm going to let Psalm 19, which Melt gave me, so that sort of set the parameters for what I would talk about. So I'm not going to talk about things invisible. I'm not going to talk about angels and demons. I'm not going to speculate on the human spirit. Is it created or uncreated? I think it's created, but it's going to live forever, so how do you handle? I'm not going to talk about the new creation, which is going to be it'll be different, but very concrete. You know? So, and I'm not going to talk very much at all about the hot topics of today, our stewardship of the environment, right? Whether we really that much more important than the bugs and the bees and the birds, and the orcas that need rescuing. You know? There's a whole range of topics that are very valid, but in 30 minutes or so I can't cover everything. So if we look at Psalm 19, did we get the second half of the psalm? I'm not going to focus on it. Okay, you can go back to the first half because that's where we're focusing. I won't even read it because it's sorry, Mike. It's a familiar psalm, but it falls into two very clear halves. So verses 1 to 6 are focusing on the material world, and within that you've got two halves. You've got the heavens, so the sky, in a sense everything that isn't the earth, right? And then you narrow the focus down in the second half to the sun, right? So that's the focus of the first half, and then it completely changes, and in 7 to 9 you're talking about the law of the Lord. And I'm not sure, Mike, were you aware that I was going to be preaching on this? All through the songs we were singing, that's Psalm 19. For instance, opening our eyes or restoring our soul. That's the first thing the law of the Lord does. It restores our soul, right? So there were a lot of connections there. And at the time, I think, oh yeah, and then I forget them when we moved on to the next song, but they were there. So the second half deals with how God communicates with his people through what is broadly called the law. And I'm sure you're familiar with the fact that in Hebrew, Torah is about teaching and direction. So the verb that it's related to actually has to do with shooting an arrow, directing an arrow at a target, right? So when the Greek translates Torah as nomos, it's potentially skewing what we understand by Torah, right? I think those connotations are present in Greek nomos, law, but we have to remember the Old Testament background. Right? So we've got this sudden switch to 6 different things that happen in terms of God teaching, and then one of those things is the fear of the Lord, which is imparted to us as a response to his law. And then in verses 10 and 11, we have a sort of evaluation of these things. They're more precious than this, they're sweeter than that. And I will come back to this idea that's very typical in wisdom literature. This is better than that, right? Wisdom is very much about discerning good and better, or good and bad, making decisions and distinctions in life. And that's the focus of 10 and 11. And then 12 to 14, it's about my response, right? So, how the law of the Lord exposes my sin or keeps me from it and frees me from it. by God's grace, right? So, as I said, it's a sort of abrupt transition, and some of the things that are different are, firstly, the agent of revelation, because I'm going to be talking about revelation, much of the time. In the first half, it's the glory of God, El. Right? This is a very generic term for God. So there's it's a Semitic word, obviously, and all of the Semitic languages, one way or another, use this word to refer to a supreme being. It's a very broad term, and I'll come back to that. In the second half, we have Yahweh, 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 7 times Yahweh. And although scholars sometimes like to think they've found this name in other ancient Near Eastern literatures, there's no plausible evidence for that. This is a uniquely Israelite name of God. It's his personal name. We were singing, "You are our God, we are your people." This is Yahweh's name for our covenantal relationship with him, right? So we move from the very broad and generic view of it's the same God, but it's a different perspective on him, to a very personal one. The topic is obviously very different. We've got the sort of vastness of the cosmos, and then the very personal nature of teaching. And Torah, we like to think of Torah as especially located in, say, Deuteronomy or Exodus, right? But in Proverbs, Torah is what a mother or a father do with their children. This is family education, right? Very personal. And so at the end of 7 to 14, we have, instead of third-person speech, this is what the sky does, this is what the day and the night do, it's I and you. We move into I, thou, discourse. All right, I'm making a serious attempt to watch my watch, so I'm going to skip over some of the other differences and talk briefly about connections between the two passages. Right? At first sight, we might think, the poet went to bed and the next morning he got up with a different idea in his mind and started on another track. Right? But because so much of the Old Testament is poetry, right? A true poet crafts something. A poet makes decisions about what to put with what, and he does it, or she does it, in such a way that the reader is challenged to think about. The connection probably isn't right on the surface, because it's like with parables, it's the process of thinking your way into what does this guy mean that helps you to begin to grasp it and possess it. Right? So the juxtaposition of these two sections invites us to say, well, what's going on here? Right? Again, there's more to be said than I can here, but the Son at the end of the first section is a sort of mediating image because it's part of the cosmos. It's in Genesis 1, it's one of the, the early things that God makes before he, creates the vegetation and so on. But its heat, nothing is hidden from its heat. It impacts us. It's the source of our life, of our ability to see. So the sun is out there, but more than that was an inside joke with Patsy there. She said last week I had my hands up too much. So So this week I've got them down here. It mediates life to us. And obviously, if the Lord chose to snuff the sun out, he'd be snuffing all of us out too, right? So that's one thing that links the two halves together. The most obvious thing, and I won't go into the details, but you can see them easily enough yourself, are communication. The heavens are declaring the glory of God. Day and night are revealing his handiwork, his knowledge, and so on. Creation communicates. And obviously the second half is all about communication, right? So that's really the main thing that ties them together. There's some interesting isolated sort of vocabulary connections, and I'll just point out one. It's the word hidden, right? Nothing is hidden from its heat, verse 6. Near the end in the prayer, cleanse me from hidden faults. Exactly the same word, exactly the same form, right? And that gets one thinking, the sun exposes, and I guess in a way it disinfects as well, The law of the Lord, creating the fear of the Lord in me, it exposes sin, right? And that's really the intent of 1 John chapter 1, talking about light. And if we walk in the light, then his blood cleanses us from all unrighteousness and brings forgiveness to us. If we walk in the light, it is inevitable that sin will come to light, because it's there. But it's the best thing that can happen in relation to a loving and forgiving and restoring God, right? So bringing hidden things to light is the function of the sun. It's the function of the Son, the Son of Man, right? So one last question before I get into dealing with some of the themes that I see here is why the emphasis on the sky? Because, of course, heaven is just a word for sky, right? It's a plural word in Hebrew because plurals sometimes evoke extension or vastness. So even the word Elohim, God, is a plural for the same reason, right? Many creation psalms, and you notice, was it the last song we sang? I think it was. No, not. One of the songs was all about Psalm 139, where can I flee from your presence? That's very much a focus on the earth, down here. Psalm 8, it begins with the heavens. When I look at the heavens, what is humanity? But then it focuses on humanity's being privileged to have dominion over everything. Most creation psalms or passages, they give more attention to the earth than the sky, right? It's interesting in Genesis 1, in verse 16, God's made the sun and the moon, and then it just adds as an afterthought, and the stars. It's literally 2 words. Something that an astrophysicist will spend his or her whole life thinking about and studying, it's written off, right? Because one of the things about creation, the way the Bible presents it to us, is that it's been created as our home, right? We've watched our daughter and son-in-law prepare for their first child, and the basement's gradually filled up with stuff, you know. And it's not the stuff that matters to them. It's just a context for that child, right? And the Bible makes it very clear that creation is for us, right? Maybe there's other life forms out there, although I personally doubt it, right? But the world that we see was created for us. We were clearly meant to care for it. We were not meant to abuse our Victorian dray horses and beat them to death, and so on and so forth. But we are not on the same level as every other life form in terms of the relative value that God ascribes to us, right? So that is something that emerges very clearly from Genesis 1 to 2, right? And it pervades the whole Bible. You know, Jesus had no problem cursing a fig tree in order to make a point, or producing a catch of fish so people could eat the fish, you know. So there's this tension between knowing our central place in God's heart within creation, and yet loving everything that he has made. Right? All right, so back to the question, why the focus on heaven here, given this broader focus on the earth? I won't give you chapter and verse, but basically that's where God lives. I could give you dozens of texts that locate God in the heavens, right? And a simple concordance search will convince you of that, right? Moreover, in Psalm 115, it says, the heaven of heaven are the heavens of the Lord, but the earth he's given to humanity, right? There's a sort of distinction there, which, for me, it raises a lot of questions about, I'm not against space travel, but do we have any business up there when this is where we were created to live? I have questions about our belief that we can control the atmosphere, we can control climate, when that's up there. You know? Personally, I think that he who sits in the heavens laughs when he sees us, thinking that one thing, our anthropogenic, you know, fossil fuel production, is driving the whole climate. Right? Now, polluting the atmosphere down here where we breathe it is clearly irresponsible. But the heavens are essentially God's realm, right? And I think the psalmist focuses on those there precisely because this is something beyond our reach. It's beyond our control. And no matter whether Elon gets to Mars or not, it will continue to be beyond our control, you know? So it's where he lives, and holiness is very much about something that cannot be controlled or polluted or influenced. And so it's a symbol of God's holiness and his detachment from his creation and his transcendence, right? And because the revelation in Psalm 19 comes from there, it's the heavens that are declaring the glory of God, and it's Yahweh who lives in the heavens who teaches his people. It's got this quality of holiness and separation from fallen humanity that allows us to put our trust in it. Right, if I was teaching, I'd say, are there any questions? But then I'd run out of time. So, but I'm willing to take questions afterwards, you know. That's one of the things I miss with preaching, that you hear the message and then you go your separate ways. When you want to challenge the preacher or ask for clarification or whatever, feel free. I mean, I don't know that I'll actually stand on the dais there, but you could come and talk to me about it, or we could start a discussion if you want. So, what is it that creation is revealing? And that was a rhetorical question, those of you that are winding up to answer. It reveals God's handiwork, right? So the heavens are declaring the glory of God, and the rakia, the firmament or the expanse, is declaring the work of his hands, right? And so, for instance, in the verb that's related to that word rakia, it's used in Exodus 39:3 of hammering out gold filigree for the priest's garments. It's very much a technological word about creating. So some people think that the ancients thought of the upper atmosphere as a dome. I'm not really sure that that's what they thought, but that it's something like a dome, a metal bowl that you hammer out, that you can imagine the rakia being, right? So Scripture is full of references to God constructing the universe. He builds it on its foundations. He lays he stretches out the covering over it. I'm glad Tyson is here, because I thought of you as I was preparing this in terms of building and creating things, very much focusing on creativity, right? But the word I want to focus on is power, right? And I can't develop that in detail, but you remember in Romans 1, when Paul is talking about how the world has suppressed God's truth and consequently has become increasingly corrupt through being alienated from it, it's his eternal power and his invisible attributes that are present in creation that are being denied and missed, right? So the handiwork of God reveals his power, right? The second thing that it reveals, and this is verse 2, night to night declares knowledge. If you look at the psalm carefully, it's full of wisdom language and motifs. It's all about not just a demonstration of power, but a communication of wisdom that God builds into creation, right? Proverbs 8 is a good example. 8, sort of 12 to 21, is about how wisdom was participated with God in the creation of the world, and again culminating in the creation of humanity. And, oh dear, time is up. I would have talked about their line has gone out to all the earth. That's this is where I was thinking of Tyler, because line is a measuring line. And you really can't do construction without at least a tape measure and probably a laser line and a bunch of other ways of measuring. And the line here is, interpreters have problems with it because it seems out of place, right? So when scholars have problems with a word, they emend it. They change the vowels or something. But this makes good sense because it fits with the rakia, something that God has created. And so this is about God's measurements for the heavens extending out to the earth. It's not, because this is poetry, the idea is not spelled out the way it would be in prose or in a construction manual, right? But that's the implication. So God's wisdom is embodied, it's everywhere in creation, starting with the cosmos, but then spreading out into the visible worlds, right? The problem, and this is the sort of side of creation that I can't get into, the problem is that his wisdom is hidden. It's not self-evident. Even in an unfallen world, it would need discernment to see. In a fallen world, it's doubly complicated because things have been skewed and twisted and distorted. Right? And that's all I'm going to say on that. I was going to use a poem from William Blake, Tiger Burning Bright, but you could look that up yourself. The third area, and this is the most inferential of the 3 points I'm making, is the sun. All right? And the sun, the word is actually, it's a word that etymologically means heat, but it's used several times in contexts that clearly refer to the sun, but it's the sun perceived in terms of its heat, right? And it's the source of life, but also of warmth. And because light is one of the primary images that Jesus uses of himself, I'm the light of the world. In the Benedictus, when the birth of Jesus is being anticipated, the end of Luke 1, 78, 79 or so, it talks about the day spring from on high rising upon us, about God's light shining upon us, clearly referring to Jesus. And so, to cut a long story short, Jesus is our Son of Righteousness, right? And if you read 1 John or John's Gospel, there's this intimate connection between life, light, love. They're all different facets of the same thing. And so the warmth that I associate with the sun is about God's love. But again, the sun can burn up all the plants you've planted, It can be destructive. In this age, the sun is an ambiguous symbol, right? So all of these things, God's power, his love, and his wisdom, they need to be brought into focus. If you like, creation is a picture that hasn't been brought into focus, and then God's revelation, his personal revelation, through Scripture, ultimately through Jesus, it brings it all into focus. We can now look at creation and say, oh yes, that's God. Oh yes, that isn't God. I mean, I hate great white sharks. I don't know why God made great white sharks, but he did. And even when they've strayed from their original purpose, whatever it was, they're serving his purpose. Creation is actually an analogy for the spiritual realm. And so, to me, a great white shark is just a visible evidence of a demon. You may not, you may love sharks. I know there are strange people out there that love sharks. So we need Scripture to tell us, yeah, this is God, but it's God alienated. It's something he's created that's been alienated from what he intended. Right? So what we have here is, if you like, a triad or a trilogy of characteristics. God's power, God's wisdom, and God's love. And a verse that's always been very significant for me is 2 Timothy 1:7. God hasn't given us a spirit of fear, but of love, of power, and a sound mind, so of sound, wise thinking. Right? And the Spirit imparted to us reflects the God who imparts it. Right? And I have found that knowing God is not just wise, not just powerful, not just loving, but all three, all the time, all together, it's a firm basis for me to trust him. There's plenty of stuff I don't understand, I don't have the wisdom, but I trust that he does. There's plenty of stuff I can't control, but I trust that he has the power to do it. Right? It's like a three-legged stool, you know, and obviously there's more characteristics and attributes of God than just those three, but without all three, the stool doesn't stand up, you know. But any situation I run into, I can trust him, you know, because he knows what he's doing. Any disaster, I mean, this is hard if you're in the middle of a disaster. And it doesn't mean it's God's will, but it does mean he knows what he's doing. And somehow he has power over that situation. How he has power over it, right, why he's allowed it, I may well not understand in this life. But he knows what he's doing. He's doing it for our good. Right? So there we are. Be encouraged.